Most people think firing squads disappeared with history books. But in 2025, the United States quietly brought them back, and almost no one was paying attention. Officials claimed these executions were fast, controlled, and humane. Witnesses described something very different. And one case in particular raised questions the state still hasn't answered. Because once you look past the official statements, what really happened inside those execution chambers is far more disturbing than anyone expected. It began with an execution few outside South Carolina even noticed. After more than 2 decades on death row, Brad Sigmund was led into a chamber built specifically for a method the state hadn't used in years. His crime was brutal, his guilt never seriously disputed, and his appeals long exhausted. But what caught the attention of legal observers wasn't the sentence, it was the choice he made at the end. Instead of lethal injection or the electric chair, Sigmund selected the firing squad. His attorneys quietly argued that recent executions using chemicals hadn't gone as promised, with witnesses describing long, unsettling delays before death was officially declared. The state insisted the firing squad would be quicker, cleaner, and more certain. On the surface, it looked like a return to an old method for practical reasons. But as details emerged, it became clear this execution wasn't just about one man or one crime. It was the moment a long dormant debate came back to life, one that wouldn't stay buried for long. Behind the walls of the execution chamber, the process was far more calculated than most people realize. This wasn't a line of soldiers standing in the open. The room had been rebuilt from the ground up, bullet-resistant glass for witnesses, a reinforced chair bolted to the floor, and a concealed wall hiding the shooters from view. Everything was designed to feel clinical, almost distant. The inmate was secured upright, a hood placed over the head, and a small target positioned directly over the heart. 3 rifles were aimed from behind a barrier, their operators unseen. At the warden's signal, all 3 fired at once. Officials described the outcome as immediate. No hesitation, no suffering, but witnesses told a different story. The sound alone was described as explosive, so violent it made the entire room flinch. And while the state emphasized precision, the reality left observers unsettled. Because when a method relies on perfection, even the smallest deviation can change everything. And the next execution would prove just how fragile that promise really was. The second execution involved a man whose path to death row was anything but contained. Years earlier, his crimes had spilled across state lines in a sudden, chaotic spree that left multiple families shattered. The violence wasn't personal, and that made it even harder to understand. Victims were chosen by chance, in moments that lasted seconds but carried consequences for decades. By the time he was captured, the case had already hardened public opinion. Prosecutors painted him as irredeemable, and the legal process moved quickly once he admitted guilt. There were no dramatic reversals, no lingering doubts about responsibility. The sentence was death, and few were surprised when appeals failed. What did raise eyebrows was the decision he made at the end. Just like before, he rejected lethal injection in the electric chair, choosing the firing squad instead. Officials stood by their claims that the method was reliable. But when witnesses stepped out of the chamber that night, their accounts hinted that something had gone wrong. And the fallout from that moment would follow the state into its next case. Almost immediately, the official version of events began to crack. The state described the execution as successful and within protocol. But witnesses noticed things that didn't line up with that narrative. Instead of an instant end, there were visible reactions. Movements that lasted longer than expected. Breaths that didn't stop right away. The room, meant to feel controlled, suddenly felt tense and uncertain. Behind the scenes, questions started piling up. How many shots actually struck their target? Did all 3 rifles do what they were supposed to do? Attorneys later argued that a critical failure may have occurred, one that left the condemned conscious longer than anyone was prepared to admit. Those claims were dismissed publicly, but they didn't disappear. For the first time, the firing squad wasn't being discussed as a relic or a solution. It was being scrutinized as a risk. And as these doubts spread, South Carolina prepared for yet another execution. one involving a man whose crimes had terrified an entire community. This time, the fear wasn't about procedure, it was about the person. Years earlier, his crimes had unfolded slowly, stretching across days, leaving an entire rural community on edge. There was no clear motive, no pattern people could prepare for. Just sudden violence, followed by taunts that made it clear he wanted attention as much as destruction. Investigators later described the scenes as deeply unsettling, not just for what happened, but for what they revealed about his mindset. He didn't rush, he lingered, he left messages behind, almost daring authorities to stop him. By the time he was arrested, panic had already settled into the region, and that fear never fully went away. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury didn't hesitate, the sentence was death, and years of appeals followed, each one failing in turn. But when the final decision came, he made the same choice as the others. The firing squad. And after everything that had already gone wrong, many wondered if the state was about to relive its worst doubts all over again. By this point, the pattern was impossible to ignore. 3 inmates, 3 chances to choose how they would die, and all of them rejected the methods the state had relied on for decades. Lethal injection carried too many unknowns. The electric chair came with a reputation no one wanted to face. The firing squad, brutal as it sounded, was seen as the most predictable option left. Attorneys began to describe it as a calculated decision, not an emotional one. Faced with methods that had produced visible complications in recent years, the condemned chose what they believed would end things faster. The state pushed back, insisting every option met constitutional standards. But the choices themselves told a different story, one driven by fear of what might go wrong. When the final execution was carried out, there were no dramatic statements, no last-minute interruptions. Just 3 shots, fired almost without warning. And when it was over, the chamber fell silent. That silence forced a question no official report could answer. Was this really justice, or simply the least unpredictable way to end a life? By the end of 2025, firing squads were no longer just a historical footnote. They had returned quietly, wrapped in legal language and technical assurances, even as eyewitness accounts told a far more complicated story. What was meant to bring certainty instead exposed how fragile that certainty really is. Supporters argue these executions delivered accountability after unimaginable crimes. Critics see something else. A system searching for a method that won't fail in public view. And somewhere between those two positions is an uncomfortable reality. When the state decides how someone dies, there are no perfect options, only consequences. So the question lingers long after the chamber doors close. Were these executions about justice, or about control? And if firing squads are back, what does that say about where the system is headed next?